everybody to this Economic Journal anniversary session. And the session will focus on a groundbreaking paper by Gary Becker, which was published exactly 50 years ago. So his paper on the theory of the allocation of time. Actually, when we were discussing with the managing editors of the Economic Journal which papers to include in the anniversary issue, it was quite obvious that we would have to take into account Becker's paper. So we have some citation figures, and actually it's the most highly cited paper in the Economic Journal up to now. Also, if you look in Google Scholar, it obtained more than 10,000 citations up to now. So it's very clear that we should talk about him today, or his work. So the session today will consist of 4 shorter papers, which will discuss the relevance, the impact, some other issues related with the paper. And then we will end with a small panel discussion with the 4 presenters. So the first presenter is Arthur Lewbel from Boston College, and he will present, well, a short summary of the theory of the allocation of time paper.
Okay. So thank you very much. I'm glad you're all here. I'm really honored to be talking about Becker's paper. Essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the table here and basically talk about Becker's paper, and then all of the other discussants will start with Becker's paper and run with it and talk about all the wonderful things that have been done since then. So Becker said that his goal was to provide a theoretical analysis of choice that includes the cost of time on the same footing as the cost of market goods. So basically before Becker, you had fairly elaborate models of demand for goods and very, very simple models of time. And so his goal was to think about time in as sophisticated a way as we had been thinking about goods. So there were some precursors to his work. So before his paper, Mincer had already written about trade-offs between housework and paid work. Gorman, who interestingly was not cited by Becker, had already written down household production and drawn some implications from it, although Becker did not think about time use. Gorman did not think about time use. But really, Becker's model is kind of the foundational model now. So Becker's setup was basically this, that there's a utility function over commodities. Commodities are each produced using little production functions, little household home economics functions that convert goods that you buy and various types of time use into those commodities. And then there's a budget constraint over all of that determines what you actually do. So basically that's the framework. It's almost amazing that it had to be invented, right? I mean, it's just such a natural thing to write downtown. One interesting thing is that Becker did not think of time as just having a single price for each person. So he said, well, if each person just has a single price, if there's just a wage rate that is your price of time, then the definition of the budget, that's what S is, full income. The definition of the budget is pretty easy to construct. And that's, of course, what everybody does now, but Becker said that was special and unlikely and really thought about there being lots of different kinds of time. You know, the price of weekend time was different from the price of weekday time, and nighttime was different from daytime. But you still, even with this more general notion of time, even with these different types of time, it's still going to be the case that essentially you calculate the budget constraint, you calculate this full income S, and then what households do is they maximize their utility function, which is over the production functions of each of the commodities, under a budget constraint. And really, I think the key insight of Becker's paper is the observation that there's just one budget constraint, that there's not a time budget constraint and a money budget constraint. There's just one budget constraint. And so many of the implications that Becker and later people have drawn from this model really come from the idea that there's a simple trade-off between goods and time that comes through the fact that there's just a single budget constraint. So Becker wasn't actually estimating models. He was doing what you'd call casual empiricism. He wasn't too concerned about whether you could identify things. He just wanted to write down the model and say what are the behavioral implications of the model. And so some of these are just examples of the kinds of implications that he wrote out, many of which are probably obvious to us now. So the notion that you would consider the shadow cost of time, the idea that as time becomes more expensive, you trade off time in goods and production. So like you might waste more food in the production of goods if you're in a hurry because your time is valuable. Or that variation in the price of time use, variation in wages across households is going to induce variation in the shadow price of goods. And so when you look at what you thought was an Engel curve, when you looked at a single time period and said, well, the price of goods is the same for everybody, well, the price of goods is not really the same for everybody. The shadow price is different because wages are different. And so that can mean that your income effects that you estimate off of Engel curves are wrong. So in particular, the income effects of earnings intensive goods like childcare could be underestimated by looking at an Engel curve. There's all these implications for specialization of labor, which Bob Pollak has done a lot of work on. And then there's just all these literatures that follow from this one model that Becker wrote down. So one enormous class of literatures are all these dynamic models of the households. So there's many, many problems we look at involving retirement, fertility, all these kinds of things, where essentially we take a Becker model and assume that's what holds in every time period, and then look at its implications or try to estimate it. Another large literature that follows from Becker's work is combining it with his later paper on social interactions, which is to say you start thinking about collective household models. And so in these models, you now start thinking about bargaining power. And so essentially, big literature following from that. In the anniversary issue, Jim Heckman's written a short comment on Gary Becker's paper. And one of the things that's very nice in that comment is that he lists many other literatures that have essentially followed from this single Becker paper. One strand of literature that I think is very interesting is issues of how do we identify these models? How can we estimate these models? And so then you want to think about what information about households can be observed? What kind of data can we see? What kind of data do you need? And so assuming that there's just a single price of time for each person, for example, really makes household models much more tractable to estimate. But then there's all these literatures that just follow from that. So Pierre-André Chiappori and many, many co-authors had this large literature that essentially start from assuming households are Pareto efficient, that we can see things like distribution factors, which are things that affect bargaining and don't affect tastes, and just use Becker's model as the foundation model of what individuals are doing, still with a single budget constraint for the household. There's the work on revealed preferences and bringing those into these collective household models. So that's the kind of stuff that Vermeulen and Church and Duroc have done work on. One thing that I'm very interested in is what do we need to see, what kind of behavioral assumptions can we make on models that would then allow us to identify household shares, in particular, identify children's shares. So if I think of children as having utility functions instead of just being public goods, then I start worrying about their welfare. And once I start worrying about their welfare, then I have to think about, well, what share of the household resources are they getting? and identifying things like that. So that's work I've done with Christian Appendicor and some others. But these are just examples of one strand of work that's coming off of Becker's work. And I guess the one thing I'd really like to impress is just how revolutionary Becker's work was at the time. I mean, when he wrote it, there were people who commented that these models were vacuous and that they were immoral. I mean, how could you think about loving couples engaging in these kinds of economic gains? And those were serious criticisms of the model that, you know, basically its usefulness had to overcome. And I guess this is just my final thought that I want to leave you with before I turn it over to the other panelists who can now start talking about where they've taken Becker's work.
Yeah. Thank you. So the next, sorry. So the next presenter is Pierre-André Chiappori from Columbia University. And he will talk about the interaction between the time allocation concept and matching patterns on the marriage market.
Thank you very much. We've learned a lot from Becker, we've learned a lot from this paper, we've learned a lot from other papers, but I think there is still much to learn, and in particular there is much to learn from the interaction of several Becker's papers. And what I'm going to talk about now is the interaction between two very important papers. One is the 65 EJ, and the other one is the 73 JPE about matching. Now, creating a connection between those two papers doesn't require much effort because Becker does it himself. For those of you who are not familiar, the 73 paper starts with a kind of rhetorical question, which is economics don't talk about marriage. How come? Is it because we're just unable, that economics does not allow us to think about this? And of course, the answer is negative. There is a big yes, we can kind of statement here. We can do it. We have not done it. That was a major oversight, but we can do it, and that's what the 73 paper is doing. Now, what's interesting is that this paper builds exactly on the technology of the 65. So it's of the household production. So it's not that the household production is something useful in the picture. It's really that the model is constructed just as an extension of the 65. Let me just summarize the main insight of the matching paper. Well, first of all, this also was completely revolutionary, that market choice, a rational decision, and economics has something to say. So, you know, it's not about love, and we know nothing, we economists know nothing about love. It's there is love, of course, but there is something else. Then there is decided that the household is a small economy, there is domestic production. That's exactly an extension of the 65 paper. And then there is this idea, which is new and incredibly fruitful, which is this notion of an equilibrium, that there is competition between men for women, there is competition between women for men. There will be an equilibrium. There is something like the, quote, market for marriage. And there is something that will look a little bit like a price. And the price will be something like an allocation within the couple. Now, in particular, the first thing is who marries whom is as an important economic component, which can be expressed in terms of complementarity, of substitutability of male and female traits. Now, there is an important word here, which is traits. That's not input. And that's a confusion that's often made. And I'm going to convince you that there are two completely different concepts. I'll be a bit more precise in a minute. And that's which I found absolutely stunning, because it was incredibly fruitful. You want to think about the intra-household allocation. It's determined. One very efficient way of thinking about this is thinking of it as determined, or at least constrained by some kind of equilibrium condition on the market. And that was a really brilliant insight. Now, let me be a bit more specific about what Becker is doing. So first of all, it's exactly what the model that Arthur presented. There are the Z and the X. The X is what you buy. It doesn't emphasize the time allocation. It's talking both about the tax, the time, and the commodities that you buy. But there are things that you buy, there are things that you consume, and there is a relationship between them. Now, what's very specific to the 73 paper is that instead of several commodities, there is only one commodity. That's a very, very strong assumption. The modern literature on matching realizes that we don't need anything like this. That's way too strong. Becker himself is sort of apologetic about this because in his 73 paper, there is this statement here. That when he's saying, you know, essentially, when I'm assuming that there is only one Z, I'm not assuming transferable utility, and I'm not assuming that everybody has the same preference. This is false. I mean, that's maybe the one time in my life where I found a statement by Becker which is technically incorrect. Why that? Transferable utility. Now, if there is only one consumption good, the quantity that I'm consuming is a particular cardinalization of my utility, in the sense that it's in my utility is increasing in this. For this particular characterization, what I'm consuming plus what my wife is consuming plus what children are consuming adds up to the total quantity. That's exactly saying that for this particular cardinalization of utilities, the Pareto frontier is an hyperplane orthogonal to unitary vector, that the technical definition is transferable utility. So he's assuming transferable utility. And the second thing is same preferences. What are the indifference curves? The indifference curves are just the isoproduction curve of the Z. There is only one Z. So you know, the marginal rates of transformation in the production functions are the marginal rates of substitution in the utilities. They are the same thing. So de facto, everybody has the same ordinal preferences. Okay. Now, this is the interesting thing. Individual traits are complement if the marginal productivity, quote unquote, I'll be a bit more precise in a minute, but of one spouse's trait increases with the partners. In other words, we're going to see assortative matching if we find that if I consider a particular trait, it is the case that increasing this trait increases the total production everywhere, but especially when you're married with a partner which has a large value of this trait. That's a bit vague, I'll be a bit more specific. Now, of course, modern matching models are much more general like this, but let me concentrate on what Becker is doing. Now, there is one claim, one question that I find completely fascinating is human capital, which is another brilliant insight from Becker, the importance of human capital. So you put human capital on the one hand, you take matching models on the other hand, you put them together. The natural question is, do we expect to see assortative matching on human capital? Do we expect to see that people with a high level of human capital are more likely to marry people with a high level of human capital? And we all know the empirical response to that, right? But from the theory side, that's coming from Becker's article, the correlation between maids for wage rates should be negative. Now, so there should be negative assortative matching. And here is the argument, and the argument makes plenty of sense. So again, the negative assortative matching means that those traits will be substitutes, but think of it that way. The inputs, so there is one production good. What the 65 paper tells us is that the crucial question is the inputs are the time spent in domestic production, right? Now, assume that the husband has a high wage. It means that his time is costly. From an efficiency point of view, it makes a lot of sense to match with a partner whose time is cheap. And that gives you now it doesn't, Becker does not provide a specific proof of this, but he has the intuition, and as almost always with Becker, the intuition is perfectly right. I'll give you a proof in a minute on a particular example, but that's right. That's a crucial point. This is not the specialization logic. In other words, this is not linked with deciding that we should see specialization and we should see one person specializing in domestic production and the other person working on the market, which is another Beckerian idea, but it's completely different. In particular, that's what's a little bit confusing here. The notion of complementarity of substitution between traits is completely different from the notion of substitutability or of complementarity in the inputs. I'm going to show you that in a minute on example. Now, the problem with this is the economic argument is clean, but it's not in the data. We see a lot of positive assortative matching. We used to see a lot of positive assortative matching 50 years ago. And in particular, an implication of Becker's argument, if you take it as face value, would be something like this. Assume that, take a wife with a large level of human capital. So she has a potentially very high wage. This woman should marry a low-wage husband who might eventually specialize into domestic production, but definitely the negative assortative matching tells you the higher the wage of the wife, you should see those women running for a low-skilled husband. And we see exactly the opposite, including even more in the data from the 50s than on the data now. The women with a high level of human capital did marry men with a high level of human capital, almost all of them. Okay, so I'm going to do two things here. The first thing is I'm going to show you a very simple model. I want to emphasize the distinction between the fact that the time inputs are complement or substitute and the fact that the traits are complements or substitute. So what I'm going to put is I'm going to put a very simple model of domestic production in which the time input are complement, and they are complement big time. I'm going to take a Cobb-Douglas model, which is an extreme form of complementarity, because one property of my model will be that the marginal productivity, if the husband specializes in market work and doesn't work at home, the marginal productivity of the wife is 0. So that you know, the extreme complementarity. And I will show you in a model like this that you still have the negative assortative matching, you still have the substitutability between traits. So let's do that. So as I told you, this here I'm assuming that the marginal productivity of the husband, the marginal productivity of each time is increasing in the time of the other, so they're complements. Again, it's a very strong version. I'm putting a very simple budget constraint, which is whatever time you don't spend, there is no leisure, whatever time you don't spend working on producing, you work on the market, and that gives you money with which you can buy consumption. So, you know, it's hard to do simpler than this, and human capital is here. Your wage is human capital multiplied by some common factor. You could put shocks on this, that doesn't matter. Now, this is a model in which we have transferable utility. The Cobb-Douglas utilities like this, they are of the general quasi-linear form. So it's a model in which we have transferable utility. And transferable utility means essentially that any efficient solution maximizes the sum of utility, not the weighted sum, the sum. The Pareto frontier is a straight line. So the surplus is just the maximum of the sum of utility under the constraint which is here, under the budget constraint, except that the budget constraint is here. So essentially, that's domestic production time. That's domestic production time of member 2. So this is capital Q. And this is C, which is just extracted from the budget constraint. Okay. So I'm maximizing this with respect to time. It's easy to find. I mean, that's a good problem to give to your students, by the way, to check that they can manipulate Cobb-Douglas stuff. And here is what you get. That's the surplus as a function of human capital. Now, you want to know whether this gives you complementarity or substitution, positive or negative assortative matching. Well, you just compute the second cross derivative. That's Becker. And when you compute it, it's negative. So as I said, that's exactly Becker's intuition, which is right. In a model like this, you should observe that high-wage women marry low-wage men and the opposite. You see that I did not assume anywhere substitutability. Of course, if you assume substitutability and you get the kind of result that Bob will be talking about in which the wife specializes, it's even more true. But you don't need that. Now, the last point I want to make is we have this kind of very puzzling situation in which the theory predicts very strongly negative assortative matching and the data tell us very strongly that there's positive assortative matching. So what kind of solution can we think of? And here is a solution, one possible solution. There are many of them, but there is a solution that I find interesting. We're going to keep the basic insight. So domestic production, domestic times as input, and the basic characterization of positive assortative matching. We still have individuals characterized by their human capital, but we're going to change a little bit. We're going to put human capital as an input in domestic production. In other words, your productivity not only depends on the time you spend, but also on your human capital. That makes a lot of sense if you think of children. I mean, the main motivation for thinking in terms of domestic production is what is it, this commodity that we produce and we collectively consume? Mostly it's children. Mostly it's children education, health, and so on and so forth. And there it makes a lot of sense to say that an hour with the child doesn't have the same input, the same outcome in terms of children's whatever outcome in terms of children's education, human capital, whatever, if the mother has a PhD or if the mother never finished high school. Well, so that's the kind of stuff. So let's write a model like this. In a model like this, you have two opposite forces. First of all, you still have the fact that educated spouses' time is more costly, and that should push you in the direction of negative assortative matching. That's exactly Becker's argument. But in addition, this time is more productive, and this pushes you in the direction of positive assortative matching. So there are many ways to do that. That's a direction that we're going to pursue with Costas Meguiar and Monica Costalias. So I'm writing exactly the same model. The only thing is not now in my production, I don't only have time, I have human capital, and it's essentially the product of them. So whatever your human capital impact is on your wage, on your productivity on the labor market, it has exactly the same impact on your productivity on domestic production. Now you do exactly the same stuff. That's the new version of the surplus. That's once you maximize, you get this, and here you get this positive assortative matching. So, to conclude, first of all, there is this technical point, but I think which has been which may not have been completely realized by the following literature, that there is a notion of complementarity between inputs in a production function, and this has nothing to do with the complementarity of traits in the surplus that results from this production function. There is a complementarity in Becker's contribution. Technically, I mean, the 73 paper builds on the 65, quite obviously. In a sense, too much. He could have done it in a much more general way, but on the other hand, that's part of the legacy of the 65 paper. That's why the 65 paper is so important. Now, let me just mention one thing that I think is crucially important. We should spend a lot of time thinking about human capital formation for children. You know, there has been a lot of talk, as you might have heard about inequality. You know, is inequality increasing, and there are relationships between the growth rate of the economy and the interest rates and things like this. Well, here is something that I find much more disturbing. Here is a story that will suggest that an increase in inequality is very hard to avoid. There is a production function. We know that human capital of children depends on many inputs. So there is time, investment by the parents in general. There is natural ability. There is parental background. We know that. We know that the same amount of time spent by the parents does not give the same outcome depending on who the parents are, and so on and so forth. The kind of empirical work that I've seen, in particular the work by Heckman and co-author, seems to suggest that those factors are complement. Okay? Now, one thing we know is that the return to education have been increasing a lot over the last 20, 30 years. It means that investment in human capital is become more profitable. But since everything is complement, the incentive to invest are much stronger for educated people, wealthy people, top of the income distribution people, than from people at the bottom. And I'm not talking about the behavioral bias or sociological effect or whatever. I'm talking about economic efficiency, which makes it extremely scary. Because if you want to maximize total output in an economy like this, the best thing you can do is invest where the investment is the most productive. And if we have this complementarity, then we should expect that wealthy parents invest much more in their children. Which they do, by the way. That's very remarkable. You look at the data, wealthy parents spend much more time with their children than poor parents, despite the fact that their time is much more expensive, which suggests that the second version of the model, there is something to it. But, of course, this is a huge engine to aggravate inequality, because you start with a level of inequality, a given level of inequality, and you realize that the people at the top will invest more than the people at the bottom, which means that the resulting inequality for the children is likely to be even larger. That's something that I find extremely worrying. That's, and there is a general, one last thing, which is the fact that there is a relationship between the characteristic of the production function and who matches whom might have an empirical application, which is when we're estimating a production function, maybe we should take matching into account. In other words, if we estimate a production function and the production function we estimate has the implication that matching should be negative assortative, we can conclude that there is something fishy with our model because we know that matching is positive. So we could think of positive assortative matching as being an additional constraint that we could use, including technically when running our estimation. As I said, complementarity is crucial. There is a lot of complementarity in Becker's different works, and that's something that I think we still need to exploit. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierre-André. The next speaker is Robert Pollak from Washington University in St. Louis, and he will talk about allocating household time. When does efficiency imply specialization?
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to thank the organizers and editors for inviting me. And obviously, it's a pleasure to be talking about Gary Becker and his work. Good. So what I want to talk about is not the paper on the allocation of time, but Becker's second paper, if you like, on the allocation of time, namely the chapter 2 from the treatise on the family, in which he talks about specialization patterns within the family. So the question is, what do we know about specialization? And obviously the answer comes from Becker. And I think the answer in this case is somewhat misleading in terms of what we get from Becker in the treatise on the family. There's a ton of empirical work on issues related to time allocation, very little theoretical work beyond Becker, really. So I want to talk about specialization, the division of labor within two-person households. Think married couple households for this purpose, although the same arguments are going to work for cohabiting couples, for same-sex couples. It really, the marriage part of this is really quite irrelevant. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the new home economics and what we should be thinking about in terms of modeling the allocation of time in multiple-person households and the role of both household production functions and individuals' production functions. So the first question is, what do we mean by specialization? And specialization really has two distinct meanings. It has a non-technical, informal meaning that amounts to saying men spend a larger fraction of their time in the market, women spend a larger fraction of their time at home. That's not what I mean by specialization, and that's not what Becker means by specialization. The notion of specialization, the formal notion, really comes out of international trade theory. It's a notion that both countries don't produce both goods. So it's a very tight theoretical notion that is embodied in specialization. So the question is, how do we get that theoretical conclusion, and do we believe it? On the face of it, it's not fantastically plausible. What Becker is talking about is what I'm going to call sector specialization. That is, Becker wants to distinguish between a market sector and a home sector. So there really are only two kinds of activities that are recognized in this model, and I'll talk a little bit about what happens when we relax that assumption and allow more activities. Becker also talks about the gendering of specialization. That is, his notion is that women specialize in the home and men specialize in the market. I'm not going to touch that because that's really irrelevant to the basic specialization claim. What we observe, of course, are both spouses working in both sectors. What's happened over the last 50 years, of course, is a convergence in the economic lives of men and women, that both men and women are more likely to be working in the market, and both men and women are more likely to be working in the home. That is, women have increased their labor market participation and the number of hours, and men have substantially increased their time in home production, while women have decreased the amount of time they spend in home production. So big changes in the allocation of time. This is essentially reiterating that from a paper Shelley Lundberg and I wrote a few years ago. Just to give you some numbers, thinking about married men and married women and labor force participation. Married men do participate more in the labor force, but notice that for married women, roughly 70% of married women are in the labor force, while the rates for married men between the ages of 25 and 44 are a bit higher. But still, we've got a tremendous labor force participation of married women. So if you believe Becker on this, if you believe that efficiency implies specialization, that is, efficiency implies that we will not see both spouses working in both sectors, then you've got to believe there's a lot of inefficiency out there. And as economists, we're unlikely to believe that. But I don't want to pivot on that claim. So let me come back to what Becker says, and this is repeating a bit of what Arthur said about the model. Households are assumed to combine time and market goods to produce more basic commodities that enter their utility functions. That's the basic story in the 1965 paper. And obviously, and that's the way economists have come to think about the allocation of time, and enormously fruitfully. But there's more than one version of the household production model, and I want to distinguish between what's going on in the 1965 paper and what is going on in later work by Becker, and in particular, what's going on in the treatise on the family. The first thing that's very striking if you reread the 1965 paper is that it's a paper about one-person households. It's often cited by people who write about specialization. There is a single paragraph that mentions the possibility of specialization in the 1965 paper, but it's a one-person household model. Also, interestingly enough, it's a model without any human capital. It's really very different from the household production model that you find in the treatise on the family, which talks about multiple person households and talks about human capital. So what are the issues that are raised with multiple person households that don't arise in single person households? We're talking, again, in both cases, about the allocation of goods, the allocation of time, and the production of commodities. There's a question about what the decision-making process is, which, again, is an issue that is raised by bargaining models. It was originally in Becker answered by what he called the altruist model, in which someone, who I've called the husband, father, dictator, patriarch, gets to make all the decisions. Bargaining models put a different face on that and forced us to talk about bargaining power within the family. An alternative is that people can make binding contracts in the marriage market about who's going to get what within marriage. A very general way to think about much of this is Chiappori's collective model, which we can think of as a reduced form for a whole range of models in which we have Pareto efficiency within the household. What I want to talk about, though, is specialization. And as I said, the theoretical time use literature is really pretty thin. And I want to remind you that the Becker assumption in the 1965 paper is one-person households and no human capital. So where do we stand on human capital? Obviously, the facts don't go with the specialization conclusion. The question is, where does it come from? And Becker, in the treatise on the family, offers us 5 theorems. I'm only going to quote 2 of them. The first one says, if all members of an efficient household have different comparative advantages, no more than one member would allocate time to both the market and household sectors. Strong conclusion, that's true, by the way. We'll come back to that, but, and what we should learn from that theorem. But the theorem itself is true. Second theorem, and I'm quoting it in full. At most, one member of an efficient household would invest in both market and household capital and would allocate time to both sectors. That's a breathtaking theorem. Notice the absence of a hypothesis. It's rather striking. Something is going on there. And this is true of much of Becker, that there is something going on behind the scenes. Becker is hard to read because you can't tell what the assumptions are, and he doesn't tell you, or he doesn't tell you explicitly, and he doesn't call your attention to them. I would contrast this with, say, the way Amartya Sen or Bob Solow write, where they tell you what's going on, they tell you what the scope and limits of what they're doing are. Becker tends not to do that. So you have to work to figure out what's going on and where the results are coming from. And the answer, it turns out, is coming from an assumption about perfect substitutes, which is being concealed in the background. And Becker writes, since all persons are assumed to be intrinsically identical, rather strong assumption if we want to play this in the marriage market context, by the way. Since all persons are assumed to be intrinsically identical, they supply basically the same kind of time to the household and market sectors. Therefore, the effective time of different members would be perfect substitutes, even if they accumulate different amounts of household capital. Notice this is a model with two kinds of human capital, with household human capital and market human capital, in contrast to the model that Pierre-André was suggesting, with one kind of human capital. Perfect substitutes are not mentioned in any of the specialization theorems in the treatise, but they're in the background, and it's pretty clear that Becker, it's at times clear that Becker intends to impose them. He uses them in the proofs, even though he doesn't mention them in the hypothesis of the theorems. What's a little odd about the theorems, though, is that with perfect substitutes, you get the specialization conclusion without anything else. That is to say, the perfect substitute assumption gives you a linear frontier. And with a linear frontier, you're going to have a corner solution. That's what's going on there with the specialization conclusion. So while none of the specialization conclusions especially explicitly mention perfect substitutes, it's built in to the analysis, although actually not with that first theorem I quoted about different comparative advantages, which is itself an odd assumption. The point is we don't really have much of a commitment to the perfect substitutes assumption. J.R. Hicks wrote, pure economics has a remarkable way of producing rabbits out of a hat, apparently a priori propositions which apparently refer to reality. It is fascinating to try to discover how the rabbits got in. For those of us who do not believe in magic must be convinced that they got in somehow. And part of the answer here is obviously going to be perfect substitutes. I'm not going to say anything about human capital or joint production or leisure. I mean, these are issues that are floating around in the background of any of these discussions. The question I really want to raise is, does efficiency in the household imply perfect substitutes? And the answer to that is pretty clearly no, not with general production functions. There is, it turns out, another special case, which I look at in the paper, where you could think of this as a different interpretation of Becker's notion of people being intrinsically identical. If people have additive production functions, and the household production function is the sum of the individual production functions, which is a very special assumption also, then you can also get specialization, provided you also have constant returns to scale. So it's not just perfect substitutes that gives you specialization, but it's pretty clear, coming back to the Cobb-Douglas case, that in the Cobb-Douglas case, if you're going to get any output at all, you're going to have both spouses working in the household. And the only question on that's left for specialization is whether they both work in the market. So the efficiency results, the efficiency claims, the specialization claims in the treatise on the family really depend on ruling out production functions like the Cobb-Douglas. Most of the production functions we're used to working with. Let me just comment on this notion of different comparative advantages, which is also a rather odd assumption. It's a rather odd assumption because it takes comparative advantage as given. But comparative advantage is, in fact, a function of time use. And if you think about the first order conditions for both spouses participating in the household will be equal comparative advantages. That's what the first order conditions will look like. So what we're saying here essentially is that if we don't have an interior solution, that is, if we have different comparative advantages, then we have a corner solution. Again, there's nothing real going on there. The other problem with the specialization conclusions in the treatise, if you take them to be general conclusions, is that they really rest on this notion of sector specialization, on this assumption that we have two sectors, a home sector and a market sector. Suppose, and notice we get a lot of linearity from the market sector if we assume wage rates are constant. But in the home sector, we don't get that kind of linearity unless we make an assumption like perfect substitutes, together with the assumption that there's only one household commodity. Suppose there are lots of household commodities, as there are in the 1965 paper. Then what does the logic of perfect substitutes imply? The logic of perfect substitutes implies that the men will specialize in a subset of the commodities, say M star of the commodities, and wives will specialize in the remaining M minus M star commodities. So the specialization conclusion gives you specialization in tasks or activities, but not specialization in sectors. In some ways, this is not too surprising if you think about what's going on with the allocation of time. The allocation of time must depend on preferences and on the constraints and on a governance structure, which I'm using as a generic term to think about bargaining or bargaining power, and an information structure that I'm not going to say anything about. And the question that's really raised by chapter 2 of the treatise is, when can you get a strong conclusion about specialization from the constraints alone, or more precisely from a subset of the constraints, namely the household production side, kind of independent of wage rates? We're not even talking about all the production, all of the constraints. Independent of wage rates, when is the technology going to imply specialization? And the answer, it turns out, is in this very special case where you have perfect substitutes. So it's an enormously strong and very special assumption. Preferences can also screw up this story. Notice that in the 1965 paper, and this is an objection Mike Wachter and I raised a very long time ago to the 1965 paper, the assumption is that people care about leisure and they care about work, but they're indifferent between market work and household work. That's a pretty strong assumption. Essentially, people don't care how they spend their work time. Or in a world with many commodities, people don't care whether they spend their time cooking or whether they spend their time cleaning. They're just indifferent. It's all work, and they're simply indifferent. Once you allow people to care how they spend their time, all of these theorems are going to disappear, because that's going to introduce joint production into the model. And it's going to look very different once people care about how they spend their time. And you might think as people get richer, their preferences about how they spend their time are likely to become increasingly important. All of this is going to play out in the marriage market as well as in bargaining in the household. The question of who marries whom, as Pierre-André suggests, is critically important here. And notice that that's going to depend not just on household production functions, but on individual production functions. That is to say, if your alternative to marrying is remaining single, then it matters what you can produce as a single individual. And given the retreat from marriage, it's important to think about non-marriage as an alternative to marriage, and it's important to think about cohabitation as an alternative to marriage, as well as about allocation within marriage. Alternative governance structure, information structures. The point is it takes very strong assumptions about the technology to imply specialization, and the assumptions really seem to me to be quite implausible. So how did the rabbits get there? The rabbits got there by assuming perfect substitutes. That's the reason we get the specialization theorems. Different comparative advantage essentially rules out interior solutions, but that's a really odd assumption because comparative advantage is endogenous and depends on the allocation of time. So it's perfect substitutes together with one other very strong assumption, namely the assumption that there are only two activities, home and market. Once we expand the notion of activities to allow multiple activities within the household, the specialization results are going to disappear. Let me just comment on a set of issues that Pierre-André raised, which I think are very important, and that is this issue about investment in children and the role of human capital and assortative matching. Shelley Lundberg and I have a paper that is now, it's an NBER working paper that's now out in a conference volume in honor of Claudia Golden, in which we look at cohabitation and the retreat from marriage in the US, finding essentially the patterns that Pierre-André is talking about. The retreat from marriage is very selective. The group that has not retreated from marriage are the college graduates. The college graduates have very low rates of non-marital fertility. And this is true not just for non-Hispanic whites. This is true for Hispanics, and it's true for blacks. The base rates are different, but there's roughly a 20 percentage point difference in the rates of non-marital fertility for college graduates compared with individuals with some college, which in the US is a very large group. Enormous differences. And as Pierre-André said, enormous differences in the time, substantial differences in the time that college graduate mothers and fathers spend with children. And it's worth thinking through the effect of the family as an engine of inequality and the role that these different investments in human capital play in terms of the future of inequality in society. Thank you.
So this is the last paper of this session. The paper I would like to present is joint work with Laurent Cherchy from the University of Leuven, who's sitting there, and Bram de Rock, who's here. So in... You don't say L3. Oh yeah, as Pierre-André said, he calls us the L3. But Bram is also partly Leuven, that's probably... So, as I said in my introduction, 50 years ago, Gary Becker published his groundbreaking paper, and as Arthur mentioned in his presentation, he was actually not the only one who was focusing on household production theory. There's also important work by Terence Gorman, but also Kelvin Lancaster on the characteristics model, which is very closely related to the models that we have seen here today. So basically, the main feature of the model of Becker is that he considers a household as a little factory, and the factory produces goods, And he calls it basic goods like child rearing, having a clean house, eating. And so households produce these goods by combining consumption of market goods, bought by earnings via market labor, and with time spent on these home production activities. So there was an enormous influence on the literature, so not only on the obvious fields like labor economics or family economics, but also in health economics. Think about Grossman's paper on the production of health, but also even on the whole literature by Heckman and Quarters on early investments in children, which is basically also directly related to the concepts that Becker introduced. So Arthur also mentioned this. There's some identification issue involved with Gary Becker's model. Not in the model like he wrote it down. So he basically allowed for different prices for different time uses. So depending on the activity you were engaged in, it was associated with a different price. But the problem is that in reality we do not observe that. And empirical economists usually take observed wages as the price for all the time use activities. So this basically all home production models that you see in reality make use of this assumption. So, but this is actually associated with a fundamental identification problem. I will show it later how it exactly works. And so in this little paper, we propose a simple solution to the identification problem. At least conceptually, it may be cute. The question is whether it's empirically useful, but you'll see that maybe later. So, and the idea is a bit that we introduce a kind of variables, we call it production shifters, that are basically, they can be seen as total factor productivities in the production of non-market goods. And if we make use of such variables, you can show that the model can be nicely identified, at least in theory. So I will first, well, very shortly, given that Arthur already gave a very nice presentation on the model, so quickly introduce you to the model, then I'll show the identification problem, and then I will show the simple solution. So it's easy, Arthur and I, we didn't really coordinate, but we more or less had the same notation, so this saves a bit of time. So basically, households have a utility function. So think about a single to make life easy, or a couple, but within a unitary framework, as Becker was looking at. So households have a utility function, and they derive utility from a vector z of non-market goods, so basic goods. And they produce them, so we have k non-market goods, they produce them by means of inputs, namely quantities bought on the market of specific goods and time uses. So all both variables are vectors, so think about the time use of a husband and a wife. So households maximize this utility function subject to a budget constraint, namely all the expenditures you do with respect to market goods must be equal to earnings by means of market labor, perhaps some non-labor income y. There's also a time constraint, namely all the time should add up to all the time uses should add up to total time available. In what follows, we make an important assumption, which was also tackled by Bob and Wachter in 75. Namely, here we will assume constant returns to scale in production and non-jointness in production. So here you see that the quantity vectors and the time use vectors are good specific, non-market good specific, and they are unique to a given production function. Arthur also mentioned this in his presentation. You can easily rewrite all the constraints I had in one constraint, namely a full income constraint. And I think that Becker, the name full income comes from Friedman, if I recall correctly. There's some footnote in Becker's paper. And full income basically implies that on the right-hand side here, you have the maximal potential income that a household can have. Namely, if you would spend all the time on a market work with a non-labor income, and this should be equal to the expenditures on the goods and the expenditures of time used by the household in the production process. You can now show that under constant returns to scale and non-jointness in production, that you can actually rewrite or have an identity which relates a full income to the production of the non-market goods. Namely, on the right-hand side, you have again the full income. And on the left-hand side, I sum the expenditures over all non-market goods. So here you see the vector of the different non-market goods. And each non-market good is associated with a unique price index. And that price index is actually dependent on the prices associated with the quantity vector Q and the time uses, or the value for the different time uses. And this idea now is actually a very nice example of Gorman's idea of two-stage budgeting, where households allocate the resources available in two stages. So in the first stage, they maximize the same utility function as before by optimally choosing a bundle of basic goods, subject to the budget constraint I just showed. So on the right-hand side, again, the full income. On the left-hand side, the vector of C with the specific price indices. In the second stage, then, the household maximizes every production function by optimally allocating resources to the different quantity vectors and the time uses, subject to a budget constraint, where yi here is actually the budget spent on a given commodity Z. So this is a standard example of Gorman's two-stage allocation problem. So how do you see the identification problem now? Well, the prices of the different time uses are usually not observable, so let's take market wages for each activity, home activity. So the second stage of the problem I just showed basically implies a set of Marshallian demand equations. So here on the left-hand side we have the quantities, time uses. They are a Marshallian function of prices, wages, and the budget spent on a given commodity. Actually, standard integrability results and demand analysis can now be applied to these Marshallian functions. Namely, if they satisfy Slutsky symmetry conditions, you can integrate back these Marshallian demand equations to the preferences of the household. And the technologies, I mean, in this case. So then the first stage then, well, in principle, you also have Marshallian demand functions. So here you have your whole vector of non-market goods, which is a Marshallian function of the price indices, so one price index per non-market goods, and then the full income. However, you immediately see now that given that the wages here appear in every price index, there's no independent variation of market wages and prices that allow you to identify both the technologies as well as the utility function. So nothing is kept constant. So if there's a wage change of the household, you will see in the production technologies a shift in the technology. So you will either spend more or less time on home production. But at the same time, you also will have a change in these price indices, which will also imply at the first stage a reallocation over the different Z's. So in some paper with, well, in the paper that is in the anniversary issue, Pierre-André and Arthur showed this. It's also in another paper by Pierre-André and Maurizio Mazzocco. And there's also an interesting special case that is related to here, and this was mentioned by Heckman. It's actually an old idea, but it's nice that he mentioned it again. Namely, the standard labor supply model is one of the different models that is equivalent to that model. And the standard labor supply model is associated with the maximization of a household utility function by optimally choosing consumption bundles and leisure, which is actually nothing else than the difference between the total time available and all the time spent on the non-market. So all the time spent on the labor market. So all the other time uses are just aggregated in one commodity. And this is, of course, not interesting, since the important insight of Becker was that you have these different time uses. So this is a fundamental identification problem. Let me now try to give you now a very simple solution to this problem. And the idea is a bit that you have some vector of production shifters. And you need a number of production shifters, an equal number as the number of commodities you have that are produced inside the household. And the production shifters will basically be interpretable as total factor productivities. So they will actually affect the productivity inside households, so through these production functions. And in the following way, namely you have again here your production function F, here your non-market good. So the inputs are Q and T, but at the same time there's a multiplication here with these production shifters. And to give an example, well, one example could be the minus the average age of children. And the idea would be the following. It's based on Cunha and Heckman. So early investments in children are important. So 1 unit of time spent on young children implies a bigger increase of the non-market goods than 1 unit of time spent on older children, without perhaps not necessarily affecting the relative allocations over goods and time uses. So there's actually a whole shift in the production technology which makes the household as a whole more efficient without really affecting the F function here. Another example could be education, actually something which was already mentioned by Michael in 1973. Maybe that more highly educated individuals are not only more efficient on the labor market, so have a higher wage or so, but also are more efficient in the home production. And actually, you can also make a connection with other work by Becker. So the famous Stiegler and Becker paper on, with the title De Gustibus non est disputandum. So you should not discuss taste differences between individuals. So in this paper, they actually say that everybody has the same preferences, but we're all associated with different prices because we are associated with different production technologies. So we all have the same preferences, but different technologies, and which is basically the same what we have here. So why now do we have identification in this by means of this setting? Well, with respect to the second stage, nothing changes. So variation of prices of a particular non-market good and the wage rate will perfectly allow you to identify all the different technologies. So a simple variation of prices and wages. With respect to the first stage then, there's a change now. So here again we have the full income. We have here again the sum of expenditures on the different non-market goods. So here you have the quantity of the non-market good. But now the price index is divided by that production shifter. So basically if a household becomes more efficient because of the production shifter, it implies that the price it is faced with will also be decreased. And now what do we have? Well, the first stage Marshall and demand equation are now a function of total full income. Again, function of all these price indices, but now divided by each production shifter. So and now you identify the first stage by means of variation in prices and income. And then the second stage is identified by holding constant prices and income, but by variation in these production shifters. So in this setting, if you have Slutsky conditions that are satisfied here on these Marshall in demand equations, you can again integrate back observed demand to the household utility function. So I think that's it. Actually, what we did here is to assume a unitary model. You can also show that a related identification strategy, but then with more general technologies, so where the S may appear in the function if, can be used in collective models to identify collective models, so where you explicitly take into account that household consists of different individuals with different preferences. So you can identify by means of production shifters such models with home production introduced. So I think we have had the 4 papers. I suggest that we now have a perhaps we can sit here or so to have a short panel discussion on Becker's legacy. So Becker made many fundamental contributions. I mean, he had work on human capital, which was mentioned here, but he also had work on the economics of crime and punishment, also economics of discrimination, and then the topic of today on family economics and more specifically time allocation. So do you see some very general structure in all his different work, or do you rather consider it as very different issues?
I would see these as related issues, but the point I would make is that Becker had a remarkable number of important basic ideas. I mean, I say this as someone who is a critic of Becker in a number of different dimensions of his work, but what's breathtaking about Becker is the number of important ideas he As Arthur said, the idea of the household production model and the allocation of time is a spectacularly brilliant idea. Now, as Wachter and I pointed out, there were some problems in that paper. But the idea itself is really breathtakingly brilliant. And it's the way we think about the world now in terms of how do we think about investment in children's human capital. We essentially think about a model where human capital is produced by mother's time, father's time, money, conditioned on the levels of human capital. That's Becker. It may seem obvious to move from the one-person model in the 1965 paper to thinking about the specialization issue in multiple-person households. I can tell you that when Mike Wachter and I were writing a critique of the 1965 paper, it did not occur to us. I can tell you that in retrospect, it seems obvious that that's the direction to go in. Prospectively, it was not at all obvious. This is a real insight that this is the direction in which it's important to move, to think about the allocation of time in multiple-person households. And Becker had insights like that in a number of different areas, in terms of crime, discrimination, human capital. He was a big idea person. He didn't always get the details right, as was clear from much of what Pierre-André said and what I was saying. But he had big ideas that had enormous influence on the profession.
Yeah, I think one of the amazing things about Becker is that he basically expanded the domain of economics. There was a certain class of things that were considered to be what economists do. And Becker was just not constrained by that class. And one of the reasons why he is so heavily cited is because he basically started new disciplines that said you can apply economic concepts to other areas. And that's still going on now. So people are now thinking about applying economics to historical events or to, where country boundaries are. I mean, there's just no limit to that imperialism that Becker basically started.
Yeah, I fully agree with everything that has been said, and I was a close friend of Gary Becker. What Bob said is exactly right. There are some people, some great economists, who are known by some results, by some theorems that they proved. That's not the case of Becker. As Bob said, sometimes the details are a little bit shaky. He's making assumptions that are way too strong or not needed or things like this. But in retrospect, the way we think about the world now is completely different than the way we used to think before Becker. And not only that, but I think the kind of question that, the older I get, the more I realize that a good researcher is not someone who can solve very difficult problems. It's the guy who asks the right question. And Becker was incredible in this direction of asking the right question. Bob mentioned this idea of household behavior. If you think of the matching models, decided that how resources will be allocated within a household, well, essentially it's an equilibrium. There is supply and demand. It's a bit more complex because there are preferences of people for goods, but there are also preferences for goods for people because it's a two-sided model. But there is something like an equilibrium price, and that's the way we should talk about allocation. People were deeply shocked when he came with this. Now, not only it doesn't shock anybody, but one thing that I find striking, my wife was trained as a sociologist, and I did some work with sociologists, and in places like the US, you have the impression that sociology is becoming a subfield of economics, that, a large fraction of the production of the sociological production is using standard economic tools, using economic models, rational behavior, and using the technique, the kind of econometric technique, and so on and so forth. None of this would have been possible without Becker. Just one last point, which is something that I feel deeply about, which is this idea of inequality. We can think of inequality as something exogenous. I think it's much more fruitful to think about inequality as something endogenous, but endogenous in an intergenerational viewpoint, that inequality is the outcome of investment that people made, not only about their own life, but about their children and actually about their grandchildren and the long list of their offsprings. The way you think about inequality when you look at it in those terms, it's completely different from many standard approaches. And again, that's 100% part of Becker's legacy. And that's the way Becker was thinking about inequality. What's the kind of process that's generating inequality, not only in the short term, and what are the returns to capital compared to wages, but in the long run, what was the accumulation of human capital? By the way, the work of Piketty, since this has been a little bit implicit, has concentrated a lot on physical capital. And it's not completely clear, by the way, what the definition of physical capital we should use. Should we use housing, for instance, things like this? One thing that Becker said as early as 45 years ago was there is physical capital, but there is human capital, and in modern economies, human capital is probably much, much more important than physical capital. If we think in terms of a production function at the macroeconomic level, which is something that, as microeconomists, we will never do. But you know, let's live dangerously for 5 minutes. Then you would expect the stock of human capital to be much larger than the stock of physical capital. So if we think in terms of inequality, I would expect human capital to be much more important, which, by the way, is pretty much the story of inequality in the US over the last 30 years. It's not so much physical capital as human capital. Again, all these were in the tracks of Becker, not of precise technical results by Becker, but insights that have proved to be incredibly fruitful.
So, as far as I know, Gary Becker did not conduct any empirical research, in a sense, as we would understand it nowadays. Still, many people consider him as an empirical microeconomist, like Jim Heckman, for example, wrote a paper with that title, I guess. So would you agree with, do you consider him as an empirical economist, or given that he does not really bother about the identification or what you need to apply his models?
I think he epitomizes the term casual empiricist, which is to say he was constantly relating his models to what you see out in the world. He just wasn't that interested in assigning, you know, quantitative values to those things.
He was interested in the world. He certainly had empirical interests. He was not an econometrician, and I don't think pretended to be. But he was always very interested in the real-world implications of theory, and just made absolutely brilliant contributions over a very wide range of fields. Going back to his paper on fertility, which I think was 1960. I was a graduate student at MIT, and when Paul Samuelson was there, this was not a respectable area for economists to think about. And the revolution in economics that Gary Becker wrought is enormously impressive in terms of bringing these issues into economics and expanding the scope of economics, as Pierre-André said, impinging a lot on sociology. And sociology has learned a lot from economics, but I think also economics has learned some important things from sociology in this process.
Well, by the way, Becker was a sociologist. He was a professor at the University of Chicago. He has a joint appointment with the sociology department. I exactly agree with everything that has been said. In particular, I think the term of casual empiricism is exactly the right one. He knew tons of facts, and obviously his way of constructing models was largely guided by those facts. But it was not guided in the econometric sense that he would take it to data and test formally. It was more, there were stylized facts that he wanted to capture. Now, one thing you must realize about Becker is this guy has the most incredible intuition that I've seen in my life. In other words, some people need to write models. Look, I wrote you a couple of models with production and so on. Becker didn't need to write models. He was just, you know, figuring out and would give you the results. I'm not sure he would have been interested in writing the models, and then you spend time doing this, and at the end of the painful experience, you realize that he was right from the beginning. And it's in a sense, there is a lot of this, even if he's in his attitude to data. He has some stylized facts, and he has a kind of great intuition on what kind of feature of the theory model will typically generate this kind of stylized fact. And as Arthur said, he was not that much interested, or Frederic, he was not that much interested in doing the next step, which is writing explicitly the model, putting a specification of the stochastic structure, and constructing the test, and taking the damn thing to the data, and checking whether or not it's rejected. You can think of it as a weakness of Becker, because I do think that scientific practice, we need to do that. But still, he brought us so much in terms of opening the door, and then, you know, I'm not that interested in going into the details, but you guys can do that, and, you know, that's what we did.
Perhaps one of you knows, but did he follow up on his work, and did he follow the literature on people who try to implement his papers, or?
For instance, just to take one example, matching. I had a huge discussion with Becker about matching. And, you know, I was talking about his model, and I was telling him, you know, but this model can be generalized in those directions and so on and so forth, and he was extremely interested. I mean, he had, what I said about Becker, he knew it. He knew that the particular model that he used to express his idea was not the best one, was not the simplest one, and was not the most general one. In a sense, he didn't care, but he was very happy that some people do the work. So he was not hostile to the kind of painful, humble labor that consists of writing explicitly the model, which we know well. I mean, that's what we do for a living. But he was very interested in this. He was very happy that some people do it. And he was following, but he was reading a lot. He knew everything.
And yet, in order to read Becker, you really have to think about what the implicit assumptions are and what the alternatives are. For example, on the matching models, Becker assumes that people can make binding agreements in the marriage market, and that leads you to the Koopmans-Beckmann assignment model, and with transferable utility to the notion that in equilibrium, we're going to maximize the sum of surpluses over all possible marriages. An alternative way to think about marriage models is to imagine that you can't make agreements in the marriage market, and that after people get married, they bargain, but they have foresight in the marriage market, and they know where bargaining is, what the outcome of bargaining in any particular match is likely to be. If you take that line, if you follow that line, what it leads you to is not the Koopmans-Beckmann assignment model, but the Gale-Shapley, Roth-Sotomayor matching model, the one from college admissions and the stability of marriage, which has very different implications for the marriage market. So again, one has to ask, what are the choices that one has to make in modeling? And Becker doesn't lay out what these choices are and why he's chosen the route he's chosen. He chooses a route and he runs with it. And what he did, of course, was to open up this whole area of thinking systematically about marriage markets.
So I think Becker never stopped being engaged in what was going on in the world. Very shortly before he died, I had a conversation with him, which is, I've only met him a few times. I had a short conversation with him about the work I was doing trying to identify the utility function of children within households. And I just asked him what he thought of that. And you know, he immediately said, well, it's interesting to think about where do utility functions for children come from? When do they develop them? And you know, children have bargaining power. They can cry, and mothers have hormones. And you know, he just listed in the space of 15 minutes like an agenda that I'm still working on. You know, he's just amazing in this way.
So I see that it's about time to close the session. So I propose that we thank Pierre-André, Bob, and Arthur for the nice panel discussion and for the nice presentations. Thank you.